Okay.
All right. Well, David, thank you for being on the show today. And I've been very excited for this. I've read most of your book, and I've been looking at the different ways in which I impact some of these things that you've been writing about, particularly the dead zones. And I actually was walking the other day and I saw a sign on one of the neighbors' yards. It's a little placard that says, pesticide has been applied, no dogs, no, kids, nobody walk on this, essentially. And we're actually currently in a neighborhood where this is all protected wetlands down below us. So roughly only 30 yards beyond the wall in this room is wetlands. And yet we still have these pesticides being applied to a lawn just right down the way, which inevitably will wash down into it. So
that's right.
If you want to start with just, introduce yourself, tell us, where are you from originally, what your career has entailed, and just start there.
Sure. Well, I'm just retired as a professor at the University of Delaware. When people ask me, I usually don't say marine biologist because I work on the smallest organisms, and so that's kind of far from marine biology. I do kind of microbial ecology, microbial oceanography. I've been around the world on various types of oceanographic ships, and now I am mainly trying to write up various books on topics that I think are important about the environment, including climate change. And The Dead Zones was one of those books. I grew up pretty far from the oceans. I grew up in Wisconsin, near Green Bay, Wisconsin. So my ocean was Lake Michigan. And I found myself to the University of Delaware because it's a great place to work. And where I live is really nice. It's really famous for its beaches and other aspects of the environment. So that's a little bit about myself.
All right. And so how long ago was it that you wrote this book on the dead zones?
I think, I had the idea maybe as much as 10 years ago, but I was involved with doing research, and doing research doesn't leave a lot of time, and teaching doesn't leave a lot of time to write books. I wrote a textbook about microbial ecology that took a lot of my time. But I had this idea, and I, of course, realized the importance of dissolved oxygen and the environmental problem that we have of it disappearing several years ago. And when I finally had time to begin writing it, it was probably about 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So that's roughly when I started the book in earnest.
All right. And so why don't you lead us in and kind of just give us a broad overview of what is a dead zone?
Right. So a dead zone, the term was coined for the Gulf of Mexico, northern part of the Gulf of Mexico. And it refers to bodies of water, and often it's the bottom layer of an aquatic habitat that just runs out of oxygen. Technically, it's anything less than 2 milligrams of oxygen per liter, whereas oxygen normally is roughly at 8 milligrams. So 2 is very low. And now there are some organisms that can survive that level of oxygen, at least for short periods of time. Many are wiped out. They're killed eventually by that level of oxygen. And so that's why it earned its name, the dead zone, because so many organisms are killed. And we see it, those of us who live on the coastal regions can see the effect of a dead zone because we see dead fish washing on our beaches. But in fact, you don't need to see dead fish to have a dead zone near you if you live on the coast. And that's one of the problems of making people aware of the problem, is that it's often at the bottom of aquatic habitat and not visible at the surface. So it started in northern. It was first coined for the Gulf of Mexico, but in fact, there are dead zones all over the world. Near me, there's the Chesapeake Bay is another big dead zone. So they're all over the place.
Right. You said there's roughly, I think, 900 today or something like that.
That's right. It's somewhat hard. We know them. best about those in the U.S. because of everyone working on them in Europe. But then you go into Europe and to some of the Pacific Islands. There's some surprising problems near coral reefs that are running out of oxygen. So that's where it gets a little dicey in terms of how you count it. But yes, the number may be 900, maybe as much as 1,000. So there was for a while there an increasing trend, but we probably have discovered many of certainly the biggest ones, and the trend in terms of increasing number of dead zones is bottomed out, I think. But and that's only because we found them all. But what's also concerned is that many of these are getting bigger. They're not going away. They're getting larger, not smaller.
Right. And so from a scientific point of view, the next question is why? Why is this happening? What's the cause? And that's really a lot of what your book focuses on, is looking at several different prominent dead zones and going into, okay, what's the cause? And so for someone like me who, I don't have a science background, sure, it can be quite difficult to digest. So why don't you start us though with the story? I love the chapter that was titled The Great Stink. And tell us about the Great Stink a little bit and how that applies to this whole situation.
Sure. The Great Stink was coined for the River Thames in the mid-19th century for London. And it referred to the fact that, well, the River Thames stank so badly that people just couldn't use it anymore. There's all these horror stories of the nobility and the parliament not being able to to go into session because the stink was so bad coming from the river. And the problem there, it certainly was a dead zone. There was no oxygen. You don't get those type of odors when there's oxygen around. And the problem there was caused by all the garbage and raw sewage going into the Thames. And that's and the bacteria used up that organic material, trying to degrade it, and used up the oxygen in the meantime. So those bacteria are basically doing the same metabolism that we are doing right now as we talk. We take in organic material, we call it food. In order to break down that organic material and get energy from it, and to make other compounds and material that we need to maintain our cells, we need oxygen. And so that's what these bacteria are doing. They're breaking down that organic material and using oxygen in the meantime. And what happened in the River Thames, and then what happened also in many other rivers where raw sewage was being dumped into them, was that there was just not enough oxygen compared to the amount of organic material, roughly, really raw sewage going into these rivers. And they just stank because all these chemicals were released that would normally be degraded if oxygen was present.
Right, and so that's also where the term, right? I mean, when they would call it a cesspool, right? Each household had a cesspool.
That's right. Instead of each household having a cesspool, the sewage system basically transferred the River Thames into one giant cesspool. So it just transferred the problem from a small scale of individual houses to the river itself. Okay. And it happened. The Great Stink refers to the River Thames, but it happened, near where I live. The Delaware River also stank really bad south of the Philadelphia metropolitan area, and it's the same problem because they're just dumping raw sewage into the river.
And what was the significance of that story?
So, bad smells are not good. No one likes them. No one likes to live on a river that stinks so badly. But the real problem in the River Thames, and then also the Delaware River, early 20th century, were the diseases that came with that sewage. So back in the 19th century, there was this thought that diseases were actually caused by the bad odors. But later we soon realized, of course, that the bacteria and the viruses that were causing these diseases. So the raw sewage, the real problem there going into the rivers was that those rivers were being used as drinking water, and people were getting sick and dying, especially of cholera and other diseases in the River Thames. And then in the Delaware River, in the U.S. and other rivers around the world, before we realized the importance of adequately treating our sewage.
And this kind of leads to some of the first big pushes for like wastewater treatment, right? Is that correct?
That's right. I mean, there were attempts to clean up the sewage because there's many reasons to do so. Before the Clean Water Act, I think what you're referring to is the Clean Water Act of 1972, one of the most important acts of Congress to force cities to clean up their act. But there were attempts before then to install sewage treatment plants and to sterilize water before people drank it. But it was all those problems associated with what we now call dead zones that kind of forced the Clean Water Act to be enacted, and that led to tremendous improvement in rivers and lakes in this country. And there's similar stories in Europe as well.
Right. Yeah. It reminds me of when I studied the first time I went to India, and I studied there, getting to Varanasi and seeing the Ganga, the Ganges River, which is just this, sacred of all sacred places. I mean, the city of Varanasi really just vibrates a spiritual energy that is unfelt. And I mean, it's, you feel it in your bones when you're there, but you also see you can literally see the waste coming from the city flowing down into the river, and you see this river just massively polluted. And coming back to the States, you start to see that, okay, wait a second, like we do have a lot of, there's a lot to be said about fundamental things such as wastewater treatment and properly managing these things.
That's right. I mean, wastewater treatment and general sanitation has been one of the key successes of why we live as long as we do. You can talk about all the advances in medicine, but and antibiotics, of course, are really important too. But just having clean water is just so important for people's health.
Right. And so, and now it starts to get a little bit more complex as the investigation into, okay, what's driving, the Gulf Coast dead zone versus the Baltic Sea dead zones.
Right.
And so tell us a little bit about, what are some of the initial assumptions, and how is that investigation developing and evolving over time?
Right. So I should say that we still have some problems with rivers. I don't think we could do even a better job in cleaning up what goes into rivers. But you're right. The story, when we get to the Gulf of Mexico and Europe, the Baltic Sea, and other places around the world, it's not the raw sewage. I mean, yes, again, there are places where you have that problem, but sewage treatment plants have stopped those. Now the problem there is the nutrients that are going into these waters. And the nutrients, what they're doing is that they're stimulating algae to grow much more so than they should be growing. We're having these algal blooms in these waters. And then the story becomes just like what happened in the River Thames in the 19th century. The organic material made by the algae, in this case, sinks to the bottom where it's used up by the bacteria. And in the process, they use up all the oxygen, and the place gets turned into a dead zone. So at the end of the whole story, it's again the bacteria, for the most part, using up all the oxygen while trying to degrade all this organic material. But now the organic material comes from algae instead of the sewage treatment plant, and the algae are being pumped up too much by the nutrients flowing into, say, the Gulf of Mexico.
So you have just this, you just have this massive blooming of all this different algae, and then that algae, you're saying that algae itself is using the oxygen, or that algae sinks and then the bacteria that are trying to dissolve the algae?
Right. You can have the algae will use the oxygen, but they're all in the surface water. And the problem is not in the surface. And that's, again, getting back to why it's so hard to appreciate the problems caused by dead zones. The surface waters may be just blooming with life. And there may be lots of fish. The Gulf of Mexico is known for its rich fisheries. But then those algae sink. And when they sink, now they're out of the surface layer. They're out of contact with the atmosphere. They can't photosynthesize and make oxygen. And so those algae now become food for the bacteria. And the bacteria go to town and use up the oxygen at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico.
Right. Okay. Understood. And so rewinding a little bit, I'm very interested in the term nutrients. And so tell us, what does that mean? What does nutrients mean in this context?
Yeah. So nutrients is you could think about it as food, plant, in this case, plant food. And usually when we talk about algae, we're talking about phosphorus and nitrogen. I talk about in the book about how my wife sometimes will be forced to use chemical fertilizer because she's run out of compost. And I talk about the main nutrients that now when you fertilize your garden, you use several of those fertilizers have several different components to them. But the main ones that oceanographers and aquatic ecologists are interested in are those of nitrogen and phosphorus. And those are two nutrients that are mainly driving the growth of these algae.
And these are, would you classify them as they're synthetic nutrients? Are they organic nutrients? Are they both?
So they're inorganic. They're not organic. Compost, I would call an organic nutrient, but it's actually turned into these inorganic chemicals, more specifically ammonium and nitrate when we talk about nitrogen, and phosphate when we talk about phosphorus. So these are inorganic. They're not organic, and they're natural. I mean, this is a very natural process that normally would drive these algae to grow and bloom and support the food webs that are present in, say, the northern Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico is very rich in life normally without any help from us. But the problem is that we're causing this increase in nutrients going into, say, the Gulf of Mexico.
Right. And you just used an interesting word, which is, you said food web. When I remember growing up as a kid and we were still being taught in textbooks of a food chain, are these different ideas now in how they would be perceived?
I think a food chain is just a very simple, grass being eaten by a cow and a cow being eaten by a wolf or us. So there's only these linear steps in the transfer of material and energy from one trophic level to another. The base of the food chain are plants, grass and trees and so on land, and in the ocean and lakes, it's the algae. And those are eaten by herbivores, and those in turn are eaten by the carnivores. So that's a food chain. A food web gets at the idea is that there's many of these food chains that are kind of interlinked, and there's not a simple linear. I mean, you could follow one path going from the lowest part of the food web, the plants, and our algae in the case of aquatic habitats to the top, but there's more different branches in that transfer of energy and material from bottom to the top.
And it feels more circular as well, right? The food web feels more circular and interconnected versus a linear, the shark eats this fish and then this does that type of thing. It's much more circular in that way.
Yeah. Well, circular implies it goes back. I suppose in a sense it does go back because the carnivore excretes the nutrients that go back to feed eventually the plant. But it's not as if somehow the carnivore is feeding the plant, but only through the nutrients, not directly. So But
Right.
yeah, it's more intertwined, I think is the way to think about it. One, it's many, food web is many food chains. It's one way to think about it.
Okay. I got it. So we're talking about nitrogen and phosphorus, and for the average person out there, they may not know that much about, these two nutrients, but these are probably the two most applied nutrients in modern agriculture, which I don't even like to necessarily call it modern agriculture. I typically call it petrochemical agriculture.
Industrial agriculture is another
Industrial agriculture, exactly. So tell us a little bit about, well, one, I mean, actually, I think the origin story of nitrogen is quite fascinating, and you go over a little bit of that in your book. Why don't you tell us about the origin story of nitrogen in terms of the form in which we use it now in industrial agriculture?
Yeah, so see, back in the 19th century, we had to fertilize our field the way my wife would prefer, that is by compost. That's basically returning manure back onto the fields. But that became quickly not very, as agriculture grew, there just wasn't enough manure around to make that efficient. And so there had to be other sources of these fertilizers. So I'm using fertilizer in the broadest sense of anything that would help plants grow. So there are other sources of especially nitrogen that were looked at. Guano is one of them. There's a big effort in the late 19th century to basically mine the guano that was off of South America.
Which is bat poop, right?
Yeah. It's bird poop, to be more specific. And the why South America is because of the upwelling there, and it's basically all these birds were eating all the protein-rich fish and dumping their waste material onto land. There were horrendous places to work and to excavate this guano, but that was for a short period of time a main source of nitrogen for farmers and agriculture in mainly in Europe at that point. But that was very limited. And it was realized that, back in the 1890s, it was realized that that was going to run out soon. And so there was this mad dash to figure out, especially for nitrogen, phosphorus or other sources of phosphorus that the chemical industry could extract and to supply for agriculture. But nitrogen was the real problem. And the problem there is that there's lots of nitrogen. There's lots of nitrogen in the atmosphere, but it's present as nitrogen gas. And there's only a few organisms, bacteria, that are able to transform that nitrogen gas into a chemical form that plants can use. And that's just doesn't happen fast enough to help out agriculture. So there's this mad rush and competition to figure out how to make nitrogen fertilizer from basically nitrogen gas. And the guy who basically figured it out was Fritz Haber, who was a German back in the early 20th century, who figured out the chemistry of being able to do that. And originally that he did that, one of the reasons why he did that was because nitrogen is also important, sodium nitrate, for gunpowder. I remember as a kid, I'm surprised I didn't blow myself up, making gunpowder out of sodium nitrate, sulfur, and charcoal as the third ingredient. Fortunately, I wasn't that good at as a chemist, and so I didn't blow myself up or lose any fingers. But sodium nitrate is a important part of what goes into making explosives. So there was back, this is during World War I, where Fritz Haber was in spite of being Jewish, was very much a nationalist and supported the German state and wanted to help out the war effort. And he invented this method for making what we call fixed form of nitrogen, as opposed to nitrogen gas, which is gas that goes anywhere in the atmosphere. A fixed form means it stays where you put it, in this case, in water or in soil. So that was invented about 1917, 15 or so. And we've been surviving ever since. I mean, if we did not have that, I mean, it's caused many problems. But it's been estimated roughly half of the people on this planet could not exist if we didn't have the Fritz Haber.
This is an amazing moment in history that probably doesn't get talked about enough, really, because it's the secondary effects, and the main one being a population explosion through the ability to produce much more food and have yields much higher than they ever would have been without this. And just to cap that story off, you said that, so interestingly, that he was actually Jewish, but he was a staunch nationalist. But actually, when the Nazis came to power, he was the head of a major organization, right? Like,
that's right. He was really worked hard between World War I and World War II in trying to help Germany recover from the devastation of World War I, and was, as you pointed out, head of a very important institute in Germany. And of course, that story has been repeated many times, that other very prominent German scientists were forced out of their positions because they're Jewish. In his case, he basically died a broken man, because he hadn't even converted to being a Lutheran, and done everything he could to support Germany, and yet was thrown out by the Nazis.
Wow. But left the world with nitrogen in a fixed form. It's very fascinating, because I think about, you also mentioned earlier, something like antibiotics. And this is one of these really complex and tricky subjects now, where we're seeing these secondary effects over 100 years or 50 years of, in the moment, it's like, oh my gosh, this is a major breakthrough. This is going to change the way, of humanity. And then 50 years later, we're going, there's super bugs that are being created. Exactly. We have to stop the world from using antibiotics as much as possible. I've met with an anthropologist in Thailand who antibiotics are a huge issue in some of the Southeast Asian countries, which is where actually I believe I saw a statistic recently that actually, like, the majority of deaths now in Southeast Asia are coming from superbugs or something like that. Wow. It was very interesting. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it's something along those lines. And this anthropologist in a group had been hired by the Thai government to try and figure out how to get people to take less antibiotics, because everything that people are getting, and we've done the same thing in the States for a long time.
Yeah. It's, as antibiotics have been really overused. I mean, people get a cold, which is, caused by a virus. And antibiotics don't work against viruses. But I think, the other thing that folks may not realize, that antibiotics are used in raising cattle, because a lot of the way we raise livestock is, very artificial. We're feeding them things that they're not meant to eat. And they need to be fed antibiotics to not get sick. And it was just found also, it's not totally understood why, but massive amounts of antibiotics are being used just because the cattle seem to grow better when they're fed these antibiotics for whatever reason. So in addition to overuse for ourselves, it's being overused by agriculture.
Right. And this topic it's a pretty good segue, because so let's kind of, when shifting back to the dead zones, the kind of number one suspect of, well, not the number one, but there's multiple inquiries as to the causing of this, and there's a connection with nitrogen and phosphorus. But tell us a little bit about, now where is this nitrogen coming from? And we can go into, like, let's say the Gulf Coast, and just what's the whole landscape of the industries and the things that are going on. And let's talk even about the watershed and stuff like that.
Yeah, so the Gulf of Mexico, it would be helpful to be able to picture the a map of the Gulf Coast with Louisiana and moving up north. And of course, the main feature there, and the reason why, again, naturally speaking, there are rich marine life in the Gulf is because of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River, of course, drains through Louisiana, but also major parts of the U.S., something like 38 states. I can't remember the number exactly now, and parts of even of Canada. And so if you look at a map of the watershed of the Mississippi River, it's just this great funnel that leads down to Louisiana.
And that's starting in roughly, is it Minnesota or Canada?
That's right. That's right. The main branch of the Mississippi is in Minnesota.
So for people to visualize, so imagining from Minnesota kind of snaking down through parts of the Midwest and then through the South, but not only the river, but all of the watershed that is coming from, other sources that all come into the Mississippi and then drain through the Mississippi down into the Gulf Coast.
That's right. I mean, at the end, it's the Mississippi, but there's the Missouri and all these other rivers that feed into the Mississippi. And so that's why I was trying to get folks to picture a big funnel that covers the mouth of the funnel, covers much of the continental U.S., and it's all draining down, funneling down to one point through Louisiana and emptying into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's covering a large part of the continental U.S. Something like 38 states are touched one way or the other, or a part of this watershed. So it's a huge, huge area.
Right. And so what's happening in that area? What's going on in that area?
So what's happening in that area is Iowa. I mean, to pick on one state, I mean, it's not fair to pick on one state because there are several other ones contributing. But Iowa is a good one because it's really famous, of course, for corn. It grows a lot of corn. And because it grows corn, and why does it grow corn? I mean, it has rich soils, but in order to keep on growing corn and have yields of corn to keep on increasing, the farmers there have had to apply more and more fertilizers. And so that's the basic problem. Because of the corn, they also have a lot of other livestock that they grow because corn feeds other these animals. So Iowa and all the other states in the Midwest there have, of course, are famous for their agriculture, and that agriculture is run by fertilizers.
Okay, and so so you're saying that because the corn is also growing there, you're also seeing a lot of animal industry focus there, so that way they're not having to transport the grain and stuff in a big distance. But now we start to get into different complexities of, okay, we have the corn farmer who is applying nitrogen, but then we also have the animal industry that is taking the corn, but then that animal is obviously creating a waste product and pooping and peeing. And so that is now also creating, quote, fertilizer, but I guess nutrients, right? We could call them. And so where are we with understanding, okay, what is really some of the main drivers of these things, and we'll go from there, I guess. Yeah.
So the main problem is thought to be that farmers are using too much fertilizer. So if you think of from the viewpoint of a farmer, they want to maximize their yield. They want to make the most money that they can from that acre of cropland that they have. And so there's not much incentive to not add more fertilizer. If they add a little bit more fertilizer, then if the weather is right, they can maximize their yield. So they're always going to add more fertilizer than what the plant really needs. And so roughly half or less of that applied fertilizer actually goes into the corn. And where does the rest go? Well, it eventually goes into rivers that eventually feed into the Mississippi River.
And this is ironic, right? Because we now have, I'm pretty sure there's solid research showing that roughly 50% or more of applied nitrogen is wasted, that it flows off.
That's right.
And I was talking to someone from the almond industry the other day, and we were just talking about the narrative of we have to feed the world. And this narrative, we don't know where it comes from, but it's most likely that it's come from several large companies. And it's that mindset of yield, 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 yield. It's all about yield. And it's not even about profitability. There's this thought that yield is going to be the same thing as profitability, but actually, in fact, it has turned out to not be the case, because if your fertilizer prices are consistently raising over time, which they have been, or if you're using a GMO crop that you were told, oh, you're going to have less weeds next year because you're going to spray this pesticide, but then actually the weeds come back twice fold and now you need more of the pesticide.
Yeah.
So it really hasn't ended up that way. And I think this is the one hope of the regenerative agricultural movement, is that, hey, wait a second, just right off the bat, we can apply less nitrogen because we know it's running off now. We know it's actually not even taking, but like you said, it's kind of like it's not a gambler's mentality, but it's kind of like, well, depending on the weather, I'll roll the dice. And so I'm going to add 30, pounds more nitrogen per acre just in case I get a good rain tomorrow, or I get, good weather or whatever, to boost my crop.
Yeah, it'll be interesting with a big spike in fuel costs. And you mentioned about fertilizer costs going up, and I'm sure they will go up even more because making these fertilizers is very energy intensive, and it's because we, in some ways, this is a whole nother topic, but I think we kept our gas and oil prices artificially low for various reasons. But now they're increasing. Well, whether that will translate, they will translate into higher fertilizer costs, and we'll see whether that translates into the farmer making that economic decision. Never mind talking about the environment, but making the economic decision that's going to be, in the end, better for his own finances to use less fertilizer. I think that's the way to argue.
This is something I'm very interested to see this year. So you're right. The fertilizer costs are already definitely up. I think 5 to 10x in the past year. I just saw a CEO of one of the companies talking on CNBC the other day, because this is really what's predicting, the coming food shortage. And that food shortage, they're saying, will be driven by the fact that lots of farmers are going to be making a decision as well of, okay, am I going to be able to put this nitrogen on this year? I guess the less positive part of that, because some of us could see that as a positive, is that in a regenerative system, it doesn't happen in 1 year, right? In order to restart the biological processes of a good, natural, healthy soil, you need roughly 3 to 5 years with doing the right things in that methodology. So it's not as simple as, okay, well, we had this year where we had a lot less fertilizer because of the prices, but now we're going to reap the rewards of all these farmers will be converted. But I am hoping that as the regenerative movement pushes forward, that this type of moment could lead to some more farmers saying, hey, you know what, I'm just going to move, I'm going to do more cover cropping. I'm going to add more legumes. I'm going to fix nitrogen during the winter and other months when I can. And I think that this is a really important part of the possibility, is having higher fertilizer prices. But it will mean in the short term higher food prices for the rest of us, and for some people, food shortages.
Yeah, that's the that's a problem that we are facing. Is that, of course, we want to reduce fertilizer use and reduce dead zones. But on the other hand, people have to eat, and there are too many people that have food insecurity, and so that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
But one thing we should touch on and discuss a little bit is the fact that something like 40% of the corn harvest goes to making ethanol that we put into our gas tanks. And I think President Biden just allowed that percentage to go higher. Now I think it's capped at 10%, and there's talk about it increasing. And on one hand, you think, well, a biofuel fuel that's renewable, less use of a fossil fuel that's not renewable, that's all good. But in fact, the environmental cost of that ethanol is really, really high. And one of them is the excessive use of fertilizers that went to make that corn that went into making that ethanol. So in some ways, we could perhaps solve part of the problem with food shortages or limitations in prices if we just got rid of biofuels, at least the stuff that the fuels that come from corn.
This is a really, I like this part of this conversation because this is really one of those first catch-22s where you mentioned that there's been a lack of regulations that have led to the continual use of things that we are generally knowing that are not very good for the environment and the overall grand ecosystem and ourselves. But there's some legislation that has led actually to further degradation. And so that was what was it called? Something, the Transport Act, or?
Yeah, I don't remember the name of it. Oh, right. They required the 10% in biofuels in our gasoline. Yeah.
Right. It was essentially the act that initiated the use of biofuels. And that actually led to like a huge increase in the corn crop, especially in these states that we're talking about, which then means more fertilizer being used, which then means more fertilizer draining into the Gulf Coast.
Right.
And so, this is something that I am finding as I go through the process of doing different research and for not only having people on the show, but just for myself, is that this seems to be one of the ways in which the reductionist model doesn't seem to work very well at all, because now we're looking at this thing that we're saying, okay, well, we're trying to reduce this carbon footprint, but the carbon footprint doesn't account for all these ecological disasters that are happening in the way that it would need to. It's not dynamic enough.
Right.
And so on paper, you could say, okay, another 5% use of biofuels means a 5% reduction in fossil fuels, which is like, okay, wow, this is great progress.
Right.
But if that means that we're continuing to do something that we have no idea, and even the long-term ramifications of what we're doing here, where all of a sudden, millions of pounds of fish and food in the Gulf Coast could be disappearing, in a matter of 50 years. So it's just such a nuanced thing. And that's actually a lot of the reason for this show, is to understand that, hey, there's a lot of trade-offs, as well as there's a lot of methodologies that seem to not enable us to view the problem as holistically as we need to.
That's right. Again, biofuels, it sounds wonderful, but I think folks didn't really think through what was going to happen. Now, in defense of biofuels, there are other crops that could be used to make ethanol and make biofuels. Switchgrass is one of them. It's a perennial. People don't eat it, so you don't have that competition. We could be using more sugarcane, although that would come from Brazil, and perhaps they would cut down more forests to make room for that sugarcane. So the concept itself is maybe not so bad. It's just when you start using a crop that we also use for our food, I think that's where it starts to get problematic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so 40% roughly is the biofuels, and then where's the rest of that corn and soybean, or just I guess we could pick on corn, but where's the rest of that stuff going?
Well, I guess it goes into our food. Some of it goes into high fructose drinks, although that's not really a big problem. And it's high fructose sugary drinks are not good for our health, so a lot of reasons not to drink those. But in terms of use of the corn, and its ramifications for fertilizer use, that's not a big problem. But it's just general food that we're eating.
Right. And a lot of that going to animal product.
And a lot of that going to animal product. That's right. And another defense of the 40% that goes into biofuels, a lot of the waste that's the leftover byproduct of that manufacturing, making the ethanol, does go to feeding animals, but it's still very high percentage. I was just shocked when I saw that number.
Mm-hmm. And so part of the debate, because it's not right now, I mean, is any of this research conclusive that, hey, it's phosphorus, hey, it's nitrogen, or how do you view that scenario?
Well, I mean, to back up, it's certainly ecologists have argued quite a bit about which is more important, and we know that as a general rule in fresh waters like lakes, and a good example is Lake Erie, which has its own dead zone problem. It seems to be phosphorus that's limiting the algal growth there, whereas in the middle of the oceans, biologists generally talk about nitrogen limiting plant growth there.
This is an important clarification for me with the reading. Explain that part of the limiting the growth. What does that mean to limit the growth? What does that mean?
Yeah, so it basically means if one way to do it is experimentally. What you would do is you take a bottle of water up onto the ship, and you add various nutrients. You can add, if you're interested in nitrogen limitation, you'd add ammonium or nitrate, phosphorus, phosphate, and also in some waters it turns out to be iron that's limited, not the waters that we're concerned about here. And so then you add those nutrients separately to different bottles of water, and you just see which one promotes the growth of the algae. And so the one that promotes it the most, we would call it to be the limiting nutrient. So that is a nutrient that's the lowest supply, and is the reason why the algae are not growing even more than they are.
Okay. So because that's the missing component that it wants to grow, that's why it's called limiting, even though it's really promoting the overall growth.
That's right.
It's the limiting factor with the nutrient.
Right.
And that's based on a nutrient model.
That's right.
Okay.
So it's getting enough of everything else. It's limited in terms of that particular nutrient.
Right. And then if you give it that nutrient, then it explodes.
And it explodes. And that's what happens in like Erie is saying, when you give it enough phosphorus, you get these big algal blooms there.
Okay.
Get to a place like Gulf of Mexico and the Baltic, then it becomes a little bit dicier in terms of which one it is. And in the end, I think it's not that important to know which one is which, although there are ramifications in how you treat the water, especially if you're a treatment plant. It varies on whether it's nitrogen or phosphorus. But in the end, it's fertilizer, and how we understand it definitely depends on whether nitrogen or phosphorus is limiting. So I think that's fairly well understood. There's again some nuances in the story for Gulf of Mexico and the Baltic Sea.
Right, and so part of it was different researchers looking at these different dead zones. And I guess then would you say that part of the challenge then is that this information that's in progress is also then politically charged, right? It's never just like there's pure science being done. That doesn't exist, right? The idea of just science and it's isolated, owned by itself, it actually doesn't exist, right? There's always external forces of funding and the individual scientists and the overarching government and country. And then, of course, the unique ecosphere that they're operating in, right? The Gulf Coast being dramatically different than the Baltic Sea in just its fundamental nature.
Right. So I think there's two levels, ways to answer that question. One is, scientists are humans. Sometimes they may not seem to be that, but they are. And so when you have two people working on the same topic, they sometimes disagree. Sometimes they disagree to the outsider for reasons that don't make any sense at all. They're not science reasons, they're more personal. So there's that aspect, and that's always going on in science. But I think the other thing that you're alluding to is the fact that much of this work does have implications for what happens on land. And in the case of the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, it's Nancy Rabelais who really publicized the fact that there's a real problem going on in the Gulf of Mexico. And that led to all sorts of legislation to study the problem, and also fight back and arguments from the chemical companies and agro-businesses against the whole idea that they were responsible for the low oxygen problem in the Gulf of Mexico. So there's those both aspects of the problem.
Right. And so this encounter with the industrial complex is it's quite a common theme with different scientists approaching it, and some of them were going from like studying the Gulf Coast, and didn't some of them go to the Baltic Sea as well to see if they could apply some of the lessons? Or
yeah, I think basically we work in our backyards. We have a area that we are comfortable with, that it's easy just for logistic reasons. But then we go to meetings in these different places and meet up with others that are working on, in my case, I worked on the Delaware River and Bay, but we'll have meetings in Europe and talk to folks that have worked on the Baltic. So that's generally how the interactions go, more so than, though occasionally we go on a cruise, or when I say a cruise, it's a research expedition. It's not a love boat type of cruise. We'll go on their ship and go into the Baltic. But for the most part, Nancy Rabelais has done all the work in the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay.
Conley has done all his work in the Baltic. So
okay, right. Those were the two prominent researchers that you were referencing. And so with there's just so many directions to go. It's curious that, tell us a little bit about the regulation that often leads to, it's a lot of times it's, well, here's some legislation, or here's some funding, but it's to study it more. Let's study more.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess scientists are always accused of that, that we always have something more that we want to know about a problem. And I have to say that's good, I think, that we want to gain a deeper understanding of a problem of, say, whether it's nitrogen or phosphorus limitation, because that does have implications for how you treat the water going into that aquatic habitat. So generally we do our work without much awareness of what the political applications are going to be, or the policies that are going to come out of it.
Right. And so, but it's interesting because it almost seems though like that's also one of the main things that's exploited by the political groups as well, is that it's used in that way of, well, we don't know enough, we need to study more. Exactly. We can't say it's nitrogen or phosphorus today. We need another 10 years of studying this. How do we know?
Right. That's right. That's the unfortunate thing, is that when politicians seize on this, what they see as being big uncertainties, but to the scientists, nitrogen, phosphorus, it's fertilizer, man. I mean, geez, we understand that. It's more of a detail of what nutrient is most limiting. Even a better example is climate change. Back in the 1980s, early 1990s, I think George Bush the first was recognized that there's a problem, but he just basically said, well, we don't understand it well enough. This is just wait before we have to do anything. And you can see where it got us. So even back in the 1980s, or even earlier, it was quite clear that CO2 was causing a big problem with our atmosphere. And all the trends were showing that the problem was going to get worse. Now, there was scientific debate about the extent of the problem and other aspects of it. Sure. Are there still debates about aspects of the problem, both with climate change and with dead zones? Sure. There always will be when you get scientists involved. But, to use that uncertainty to argue that we shouldn't do anything, it's just not right.
Right. It's interesting because I'm a former free market capitalist entrepreneur who was, I was trained in what's called lean methodology, which is an iteration process where you work as fast as possible to see if you have market fit with whatever product or service you're trying to do. Instead of, a lot of times people will say, oh, I have this great idea. And then they go and spend 2 years, building something, and then they bring it to the market and people go, I don't want that. I have no use for that. And you go, but it was such a great idea. Whereas in this process, you're trying to build a prototype or what's called a minimum viable product as quickly as possible to then show people to see, hey, would you be interested in purchasing this or even pre-ordering it? That way you reduce a lot of the risk. And I think this is one of the challenges with systems of government that move so slow, and the entanglement of that and science, in that it can be a costly endeavor, because there are lots of times when the science can be wrong and we could go and spend $500 million on something and turn around and go, oh, that wasn't really the issue.
Right.
But it seems that the balance is kind of out of whack sometimes. And this is really, I now come from a space where, I just spent the past year as a apprentice at a medicinal herb farm, and, spending our time with all these medicinal herbs and, studying native traditions and First Peoples traditions of, here in America as well as across the world. And it's just fascinating to me how they don't even need science. They never needed it, right? There's examples of, there's stories of indigenous Japanese in the 1700s or 1800s saying, hey, our climate is changing based on some reasons, or just the relationship that peoples have always had with their relationship or with the land and the animals, that they didn't need to know that, like, hey, you shouldn't, you don't crap where you eat type of mentality, which is for us, it's like we've moved beyond that. But now we're in this spot where because our mode of being is no longer connected with nature in a way, we're trying to force other templates. And I think from my perspective, I see science now becoming very religious. I see lots of people using science in a very religious way, whereas to me, it should not be a way of being. Science is not a way of being. Reductionism is not a way of being. It's a great tool. It's a great tool to observe our environment, which we've been doing for thousands of years. But it's not. But a lot of times it's a reactionary thing to organized religion, and then it's polarized immediately because of that. Versus if we were still connected with nature in a way, then we know that, hey, this tree is very important to my existence, and I view it as a relative rather than something that should produce me something because I told it to.
Yeah, I think you hit it right there, is that too many people are disconnected to nature, and they think of it as a luxury. That it's really nice if we had lots of forest land or clean waters, but first thing is people have to have a job and they have to eat. Well, I think we're starting to realize that we cannot have that disconnect and still be a healthy society.
Yes, for sure. And yeah, there's so many ways where this disconnect, and now I feel like science is really trying to fill this gap, but it can't necessarily do that, right? Science doesn't necessarily have the ability to teach us to love nature, to love all beings. Right. It has the methodology to observe them and to learn about them, but it doesn't have that love component. And I feel like I keep hearing people talk about, well, people just need to see data. Well, that's not working, and it hasn't worked, and it's never worked. Actually, there's all the data is there for any, of these things we could be looking at, but it's really,
Yeah, I was going to say, climate change again is a great example. And you're right. Scientists used to believe that. I think we're increasingly realizing that that's not the case. If only people would know, if only we show them the data and show them what's going on, then they'll come around to the right view of how to solve the problem. And as you said, that's just not working. It's just, and climate change is a great example. The reaction against COVID and the anti-vaxxers is another example. You can show them all the data you want, but it's almost a religion that these folks are getting vaccinated. It's almost a religion that they react against the idea that humans are causing our climate to change. So yeah.
And it's interesting, right? Because, and I think there's also I think there's good reason sometimes for people to be hesitant of this, right? I view a lot of people, I know a lot of very educated people who are hesitant even with a vaccine because they know that a lot of times this data is being manipulated, it's being forced upon them. And so this is something where I'm actually looking to take up, some more Bible study recently, because I think actually the main question to ask these farmers, if they are in fact conservative and if they are in fact Christian, a lot of times, what is their view on the idea of stewardship? What does stewardship mean to you? I think that is way more powerful than, hey, let me show you this data.
Right. And show you what's happening in Gulf of Mexico, 500 miles down.
Right. They're going to go, I don't care. It's, what about the economy? What about people's jobs? What about my business? But I want to know, what do you think about being a steward? What does that mean? Does that mean that you dominate everything? Does that mean that we kill whatever we want? Does that mean, what was Christ really, who was a martyr?
Right.
What would his thoughts be on this? Let's be real about this. Let's sit with this for some time. And I think that that's actually, to relate people to that is probably it could be a way to drive a lot more positive conversation in sometimes, because if not, I feel like we are in this kind of battle with certain things. And I'm interested as well in just, whether liberal or conservative, all of us here are, non-native now.
Yeah, right.
And so really it's about, okay, wait a second. Well, when did we get disconnected from our nativeness, right? At the end of the day, all people are indigenous, but we've just been disconnected for some time. So when did the Celtic tribes, which were hundreds of tribes, thousands of tribes spread across Europe, what happened to them, right? Caesar slaughtered them. Yeah. Caesar came through and slaughtered them. And that was the, part of the roots of, hey, wait a second, now you don't have a relationship with the oak tree, right? You're no longer holding your ceremonies among the oak trees in the oak forest, and you're no longer using the oak as your medicine in your community.
Right.
Which is the same thing that a lot of native peoples in America would have done. And there's that connection there. But I think if we try and approach it only from, a science perspective, sometimes it can be quite limiting in the conversation, and not only the conversation, but in the way of being. But to get back to some of the science, because it is important, the study of this, I mean, would you say that, I mean, maybe a little bit more into the details, because I'm trying to understand this as an average person, but from my understanding, like, to have causal evidence is like very rare in science. Like, there's very few things where we have like strict causal research that's like, this is a definitive quote fact, whereas most research is correlative, right?
Yeah, well, I guess most scientists would kind of disagree that it's more than just correlations. And I think perhaps maybe the point of discussion is what you would call a fact. Now, so let's say take the statement, nitrogen causes algal blooms. It's a limiting nutrient. I think most aquatic ecologists would say that's a fact. But are they not studying it anymore? No, they are very much, because they're very much interested in levels of the form. How does it get there? Who's, naturally speaking, besides our nitrogen pollution problem, who's producing that nitrogen? So there's still a lot of things about it that mean there's uncertainty about it. So I think that's where again, we're getting back to this question about people seeing the uncertainty, the fact that scientists still argue about nitrogen causes algal blooms means we don't have to do anything about it. Well, that's at some level they do agree that there's a fact called nitrogen causes algal blooms. They may disagree. Scientists may disagree about aspects of that problem.
Okay. And so, but the nitrogen causing the algal blooms, like that is that just like something that is shown as a very high correlation, or is it like causal?
Well, you can do experiments like I described. I mean, one piece of evidence is causal. You can see the increase in nitrogen, and you see algal blooms. We know that algal blooms occur when nitrogen concentrations are high, but you can do experiments. You can take that bottle of water onto the deck of the ship and add nitrogen and see that it causes a bloom. And then I described in the book about a really big experiment where I can't believe the scientists were able to convince a treatment plant to turn off their nitrogen control mechanism and see what was going to happen to this area of the Baltic Sea.
Wow.
And they did the experiment and saw what happened in terms of the bloom of this cyanobacteria. So
and did that lead to kind of a more definitive approach by the government there?
That's right, because there was this argument that, in fact, if they limited the nitrogen going in, if they treated the water for nitrogen, you would get these toxic cyanobacteria blooms. And they were actually more concerned about these toxic blooms than about other types of algal blooms that would lead to dead zones, but maybe not necessarily toxic by themselves. So there was that idea. In fact, there are some very extreme statements that we should actually add nitrogen to discourage or stop the growth of these toxic algae. So the scientists convinced the treatment plant to do this experiment and showed that, yes, you do get more cyanobacteria. It's a type of algae that grows if you limit the nitrogen, but it's not the toxic ones. So it very definitely led to a change in what the government was doing.
Okay. Yeah. And that was interesting because you mentioned that one of the most forward governments on this is Denmark, I believe you mentioned.
Yeah. Now my scientist friends in Denmark say, well, it looks great, but maybe there's all these loopholes that the farmers are able to get out of. But yes, they're supposed to justify the fertilizer that they add and do other measures to really limit the amount of fertilizer that they use on their farms.
Right.
We have a big problem with manure also in Denmark from a very intensive hog production. But they've been trying their best to limit the amount of nutrients that go into the surrounding waters.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. Have you ever heard of Korean natural farming?
No.
I think I'm gonna have to send you a bunch of resources, but I think it's gonna blow your mind. So essentially there's always been natural farming techniques and indigenous ways of helping a crop grow that really we haven't looked at for the past 150 years or so. Actually, I'm reading a book right now on the Iroquois from kind of like, I think it's Quebec and northern United States where they were, and they would make medicine of the corn plant, or they would make medicine of other ones, and then they would soak the seeds that they were getting ready to plant into those. which is now a very prominent regenerative idea of soaking seeds in biological solutions in order to help stem the ability of the seed and the plant to call forth different biology in order to call forth all the nutrients that they want.
Yeah.
But this guy named Master Cho, he was a brilliant chemist, but he's kind of an anarchist, right? He was kind of this guy who said, the farmer should not be buying any inputs from either a synthetic supplier or an organic supplier. And you should be able to farm organically at scale for $100 an acre, which is now like $6,000 an acre on average in the US.
Yeah.
And he essentially collected up all the natural farming techniques that were happening in Asia before he was noticing the synthetic things creeping over and how they were starting to lose lots of different things in their ecosystems, and that the farmer was becoming more and more dependent. So he collected all these things, but then he wanted to improve them. And so you make all these fascinating things, right? So one of them is fermented plant juice. So you might collect a bunch of dandelions and then ferment them, and that juice that's left over is a broad spectrum juice that has all sorts of plant soluble ready for the plant to uptake of, manganese, magnesium, copper. I mean, all the different things that this plant has. And so I just came from meeting with a very prominent natural farming expert last weekend, and he loves stinging nettle. He calls it the multivitamin of nature, which is in herbalism. Nettle is used for lots of different things, but it also produces a very broad spectrum of nutrients. But one of the things that Master Cho is most known for was originally was pigs, and building these what's called a living floor for the pigs. And it's about a couple foot deep, and it's a living floor. And you can walk up to anyone who's using this these days right now, and you will not smell a single thing.
Wow.
You don't smell a single thing, because one of the main things they use with this is lactobacillus. And you make your own lactobacillus at the farm. You can make lactobacillic organisms with just rice water, essentially, and you can grow those organisms, and then you spray that onto the bedding or onto the poop, and it degrades it much faster. And I'm really curious to see, because this movement is really just starting. It started to take hold in Hawaii, and now it's moving more and more to the mainland US, where more and more people are starting to use this methodology. But I would be very interested to see some scientists do research on, with the living bed system, what happens to the nutrients and what gets converted at the site versus flushing away.
Right.
With what's happening, because there's all sorts of transformations happening at a biochemical level with these things. And so it's really fascinating. Not a lot of people know about it. It's absolutely the future, because again, you can use these broad spectrum, all these different inputs. And so one of them is like a fermented, you get leftover fish heads from your local restaurant, your seafood place, and then you ferment those in I think they use brown sugar. And then at the end, you get this leftover liquid, and that liquid is packed with nutrients that the plant wants to uptake. And you can spray it as a foliar spray onto the plant, or you can put it in as a drench into the soil.
I wonder if it's acting also as an anti-fungi, anti-pathogen defense by the plant.
Well, it's a mix, right? So we actually also, one of the main amendments is we make what's called indigenous microorganism. And so we actually go and collect a fungal collection from, you want to go to the area that has the most old growth forest as possible in your region, and just pull some leaves away and look if you can see the strands of mycelium, right? In general, what we've been told is that if you can see the mycelium with your naked eye, it's generally a beneficial mycelium. It's not a pathogenic one.
Right.
And
there are many.
Yeah. You set this box of cooked rice on top of that area, and you come back about 5 days later, and it's been populated with all those fungi and bacteria. And then we take that, we make it shelf stable, with brown sugar, and then the brown sugar puts the organisms to sleep, right? They go to sleep. And then when you scoop some out and put it into your water mix, they come back to life and you can spray them. And so we're actually inoculating the soil back with the ratios of fungi and bacteria that would have been there if this were allowed to naturally success through the stages of time.
Yeah.
But we're doing it we're doing it in a way to where if you have land that's been degraded by fertilizer and pesticides year after year, you can quickly inject biology back into it.
Yeah. Improve the soil quality basically much faster than if you had to rely on nature alone.
Much faster, exactly. And this is one thing people are having a little bit of a hard time understanding is that if you have a piece of land that has been degraded by industrial agriculture, the last thing you should do is just let that land sit there now unused, because nothing will happen to it. It'll collect some weeds for the next 100 years probably before it even really starts to transform. But if you come in and just start putting biology back into it and giving it these minerals, then you'll start to get the type of population of things that are much more beneficial.
Yeah.
But I would love to see some science done on this part. But again, who wants to do that? Because there's no money to be made. We can all make these things at home.
Well, I as a scientist, I hope that if we knew more about the actual mechanisms, what's going on, why these things work, we may be able to prove them and maybe make them and, make it so that other people can use them more easily.
Right.
So I think science would help, do this even better.
Definitely. And I think that's, a lot of us are holding to the regenerative agriculture movement as being, one of the only saving possibilities in this. Because, even so one of the, I tried to look for some rebuttals online as I read your book. I wanted to see, okay, what would the farmer what would the farm, bureau in Iowa say, or what would the chemical companies say to this? And most of them were quite poor arguments. I mean, I think I sent you one of them that we had seen, but there was one that I find quite interesting, which was that a large part of the problem could actually just simply be that there's no cover crop, or there's no crop in the ground a large part of the year where nutrients are purely just running off. And that would never be the case in nature, right? Where you would have uncovered ground. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I think there are some fairly straightforward solutions. I won't say solutions, maybe a bit extreme word, but certainly help the problem and lessen the runoff of fertilizer. And you mentioned one of them is cover crop. Just planting something in the winter that would, those plants would take up those nutrients that otherwise would run off into a stream, lake, and eventually the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. So cover crop is one of them. And it's also a benefit to the farmer. I think that should be also emphasized. It's often called the green fertilizer, in the sense that if you plant the right type of cover crop, you're going to be able to plow that in and help the soil. And helping the soil helps your yield and profitability. Another one is buffer zones. Just having a zone 30 feet. I mean, the width is debatable, but something between the river, creek, and where the corn is planted. That also would help soak up the nutrients before they get to be a problem.
Right. And, it's really interesting how you mentioned that, because one of the articles that I was reading, it has cover crops as a, quote, conservation practice, which is actually not the way that I think of it at all. Yeah. At all. I think of a cover crop practice as a way to increase your profitability, actually, as a farmer. And by virtue of that, as well as by virtue of increasing biodiversity and the biology in the soil that are coming up to get specific nutrients from certain plants, that you're then increasing your nutrient availability and your nutrient cycling, which all leads to profitability for the farmer. And so it's just interesting that in this article toward the farmer, it's framed as a conservation practice, where from most of what I've been exposed to is it's more based on just increasing resilience and profitability over time for the farmer. But it's fascinating.
Right. I mean, the farmer could gain some, help from the government if he calls it a conservation practice. But I think you're right. In the end, it's going to help him on his bottom line, not just some wishy-washy type of environmental effect.
Right. And you mentioned this, though. This is kind of an interesting thing. And especially I've been deep in the world of carbon credits for the past couple of weeks, and understanding of, okay, is this a good idea? Does it have the potential to be a good idea? Or is it kind of a sham where these companies are just offsetting? They're not really innovating, or they're not adopting innovative technology, or they're not, reducing their emissions. They're just using a carbon offset to cover up whatever they're doing. But you mentioned that one of the main positions that we've done in the States is a quote, pay the polluter. What does that mean? Tell us a little bit about that.
So the phrase came from an article written by Don Bosch, who's been doing a lot of work in this area. He's now retired. He got his start down in LUMCON, Louisiana University Marine Consortium, I think is what LUMCON is. And then he eventually became president of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Studies. And he wrote an article. He said, basically, we have to stop paying the polluter. That is, we pay the farmer to plant a cover crop. The farmer gets help from doing that. And so that farmer, maybe a bit extreme to call him a polluter, him or her, a polluter. Certainly the type of pollution that a farm puts out is different from, say, an oil company, but in the end, it's pollution, it's nutrient pollution. And the idea is that we should do what we do with other polluters. That is, we find them, we should make them pay.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've been looking at, what can qualify for a carbon, even for carbon farming, and what can you do? And it's essentially is that you have to be able to show this idea of additionality. So based on your, however much carbon your soil has today, you have to show that you're going to be increasing that. But for example, let's say that you're a farmer who has been taking care of your soil for a very long time, and you're doing all sorts of different beneficial practices. You've reduced your nitrogen, you've reduced your phosphorus. You would not be able to qualify for carbon farming. So it's only incentivizing people who have chosen to not do better things over time, or even now just coming to it. Because a lot of them, I don't think it's a choice, right? I don't think the average farmer has like this malice within them. I just think that they're within an industrial complex that has told them for all of time, this is your worldview. This is how you should view nature and your crop and your farming system. And they're just starting to get exposure to a new way, but that's scary.
Yep. I mean, I sympathize with them. I'm sure it's a tough life. They feel that they have to apply all this fertilizer to make sure they maximize their yields. But as we talked about before, it may maximize their yields, but it may not maximize the profit. That's the end goal.
Yeah, for sure. Did you choose to not call them synthetic nutrients in the book for a reason?
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess I thought it may confuse issues, because phosphate and fertilizer is the same as phosphate in the environment. It becomes synthetic when we apply it, I think, is way that most people would use that term. So I think I didn't find it really useful. I think people kind of have this feeling that all inorganic fertilizer is bad. all inorganic nutrients are bad. But in fact, that's what the plant is really taking up. They're taking up nitrate, ammonium, and phosphate, those simple inorganic versions of nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, organic farming or applying organic fertilizer is great because it's helping the health of the soil. But then eventually what's going to happen is the microbes break down that organic material to ammonium and nitrate and phosphate that's used by the plant. So that's why I guess I shied away from that term.
Right. You're not thinking like an advertiser. You guys got to start thinking like advertisers now. You got to advertise your ideas and get it out there. I mean, whoever the person who came up with the dead zone, they had more advertising within them.
It was a journalist who came up with it.
Right. Exactly.
And you know, scientists kind of hate the term. They kind of cringe because you know, a dead zone. There's lots of life in a dead zone. It's just microbial and things that we don't really appreciate. It's not the fish in there and so on that we would like to see.
So let's talk about that, and because we're orbiting the dead zone here. So this is an important point: is that what's happening in terms of the life down there? So you have species that would normally be flourishing, or not even flourishing, but just normal populations, and they're being reduced, and then the ramifications that has with second order effects with other organisms that would eat those, and then as well as I think some more kind of pathogenic type of advantageous things probably happen as well. At least that's what happens in soil. But tell us about that. What's happening?
Yeah, so the sessile organisms, the sessile invertebrates, have no choice, right? They're stuck there at the bottom. And so now if this is a new thing for them, they're toast, they're dead, right? So that's going to depopulate that sediment, that bottom, that benthos. And the ramification of it is that even those mobile organisms no longer can feed on them. So you're cutting out a food source for those organisms that were able to swim away. Now, the other thing that happens is that the fish that can't swim away are going to be forced into a smaller habitat. Their habitat is being reduced by the formation of this dead zone because they can't swim or survive for long in this low oxygen waters. So even though if they can swim away, their habitat is reduced. We get the fish kills when they can't swim away, when they're confined to a narrow bay. Around here, we have these human-made canals that basically become end zones that are depleted in the summer of oxygen. You see all these fish floating into the surface because they can't swim away. But even if they can swim away, their habitat is being severely reduced in size.
And so this is an interesting part of the conversation because this also has ramifications beyond just, okay, the natural ecosystem is changing, but also the way in which humans are then sometimes taking advantage of this in terms of fishing practices. Tell us about what's happening with that. Yeah,
so the thing to keep in mind about the dead zone is that it's right around that there may be just abundance of life. And again, the dead zone was created in the case of the Gulf of Mexico and the Baltic Sea because of excessive algal blooms, which when they're of normal levels is great for the rest of the food web in those waters. So there actually can be a concentration of organisms right at the edge of a dead zone because that's where the algae in the food is highest. And the fishermen are not dummies. They can recognize this, and that's where they go to harvest their fish. And so that's why the relationship between dead zones and fisheries is really, really complex. You'd think it'd be, well, less oxygen, fewer fish, less fish to be caught. But in fact, it's not that simple because these fish can move. And in fact, they may have the perverse effect of actually concentrating them where they can be caught more easily by the fishermen.
Right. So that's like, as the habitat gets smaller, that means that the boats are coming to a smaller, more concentrated area.
Right. Or the fish or shrimp are going to the edge of the dead zone because that's where they're kind of playing with fire basically. They want to have the food that's there, but of course they need to have the oxygen too. So they're going right to the edge, the boundaries, and that's where you see the fishermen.
And do you see, is there stories of companies using this as a strategy, from boats using that?
I haven't heard about that because you can't see this from space, for example. There are huge fishing companies that use satellite information to look for chlorophyll,
wow,
pigment and algae, and then look for fish. But the dead zone, low oxygen waters are below the surface, so you can't see them from space. But I believe the fishermen can look at temperature and other aspects of the water that can get a sense of where the low oxygen places are.
Okay, yeah, that would make sense. That there would be some methodology where they could figure that out.
And what's going on? Yeah.
Yeah. So what led you to study such small organisms?
Yeah, that's a good question. I remember taking a microbiology course in college, and it didn't really do much for me because it was more of a traditional one, focused on, I think all the students were pre-med students. So I kind of, not for me. But I spent a lot of time in Woods Hole and got exposed to folks that were doing what I now recognize as being microbial ecology. And I could see that these, really small organisms had these big consequences for the environment. And they were doing all these fascinating things in the world around us. And I was just intrigued by that, I guess, contrasting scales.
Right. And they're also as a young person, right, there would always be more opportunity as well to study the smaller things than the bigger things that everyone else has already studied.
Well, some of the organisms, E. coli, for example, has been studied to death. Some viruses have been studied in incredible detail. So there are some aspects of microbiology that are really, really, really well known. But then there are other aspects, and especially related to the environment, that are new, still new. The field, you could say it started back in the late 19th century, or perhaps even earlier, but it really came into its own last couple of decades.
Wow.
So there's still so much to be done. And we're still recognize the relationship between organisms, microorganisms, and the bigger world around us.
And it's really amazing because, we kind of, I think, in general society, we're always told, but there's just still so much we don't know about the ocean. And it's so true. At the same time, what we're seeing now as well, even on the land, is we don't really know anything about all these different microorganisms. We really know so little about all, the fungi and their processes and how they're going for thousands of miles, essentially, that we could never imagine, and they're communicating, and it's a living network. And so it's even harder task, I imagine, to then get down to the depths of the ocean and figure out and moving water and just all sorts of stuff. It's quite a challenge.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I like about it, of course, is the challenges, but you have to know a little bit of chemistry, you have to know a little bit about physics, and of course biology to understand what these organisms are doing in the oceans.
So you mentioned physics. One of the other main arguments against the nutrient, I don't want to call it theory, the nutrient understanding of pollution, is that they would say it's weather patterns. It's the weather is changing. And you mentioned weather, you mentioned wind, and you mentioned stratification. I don't know if those are all three connected, but let me just let me put those up there on the table, and you can kind of run us through, what is the impact of weather? Is that something that scientists feel is a driving force of the dead zone, or why it's not? And then tell us a little bit about the stratification in an average Joe and Jane sense.
Okay, sure. So I mentioned several times that these low oxygen waters are at the bottom, and that can be only the case if there's stratification. So stratification means that there's less dense water on the top of the water column at the surface and more dense water at the bottom. And you get that difference in density from two factors. One is the temperature. Warmer water is lighter than cold water. So you see warmer water at the surface, cold water at the bottom. I mean, if you go swimming, I remember as a kid going swimming sometimes these lakes, and your chest or head would be really nice and warm, but your feet could be cold because what we call a thermocline is so close to the surface that you could actually feel that over 5 feet, 6 feet of a person. So temperature is a big impact on stratification. The other one is salt content, and that becomes a factor when you see the Mississippi River, which of course is fresh water, flowing into the Gulf of Mexico, which is salt water. So now you have this river, nutrient-laden river, going onto salty water, and over the top of salty water. So you have stratification, and that makes it possible for the bacteria to bring the algae down there not to come in contact with oxygen-rich waters at the surface. So that's also really important in the ingredient in setting up a dead zone, that stratification. Okay. So now weather comes into the fact that if you have winds that are strong enough, you could potentially mix up some of that and break down that stratification. And that's one of the challenges going forward with dead zone work, is how much weather will be changing, that is, a climate will be changing, and how that will impact stratification and the depletion of oxygen in bottom waters.
Okay. And go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that the general feeling is that, well, the planet's going to get warmer. We're going to have more stratification. The surface waters will warm up faster than deep waters, and so there will be more stratification, and we'll have more of a problem with oxygen disappearing from bottom waters.
Right. And so what would be the short form of what you would rebuttal to someone who says it's not the nutrients, it's the weather?
Well, the short form is sure, yeah, you need stratification, but without that algal growth, you don't have a problem. So I think it's you can't argue that you need to have the stratification, although the River Thames is the example. There was quite well mixed, but there's so much sewage going in that oxygen is stripped out regardless of stratification. But in the Gulf of Mexico, you need it. But without the algae growing like gangbusters because of all those nutrients flowing in, you don't have a problem.
Right. Okay. And again, just to kind of reiterate that point, is that we're dealing with mostly invisible forces, which is the big challenge here. That it's hard for even like I was talking about earlier, like it's hard to physically show the neighbor over here that, hey, the pesticide that you just put on that grass, and literally it rained like the next day, and it's all a downhill movement right into this preserve area.
Yeah.
And so it's hard. I mean, and this is something that as an ex, what I would call, branding and marketing person, which is essentially my expertise is in perception, human perception, and working with that. And one of the key things in behavioral economics is how do you make something that's invisible visible, right? Okay. So for example, it's known that some people would call the carbon footprint a sham because BP hired Ogilvy and Mather, which is one of the most famous advertising organizations ever created, to create the idea of the carbon footprint, to give this invisible thing something visible, something tangible to where you'll be able to track yours. Now, it's probably a good idea but the one key part I think people worry about it's a sham is because the main messaging is it's you,
Right.
Mr. and Mrs. Consumer, it's your responsibility. Meanwhile, over 71% of all the emissions are from large corporations.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so in that way, it does feel a little bit sketchy.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
overall, but imagine though the principle of that of wait a second, before I'm eating apples, I'm eating oranges. This orange comes from California, or this orange comes from, South America. What's the difference in terms of emissions as well as ecological things? What's happening there? And so bringing that visible aspect to an invisible challenge is such a key component that I really hope science and scientists start to like naturally come forward. I see this kind of movement growing, right? There's a growing movement of, I think, scientists who are understanding that, hey, wait a second, I can't just be a great scientist. I also have to be a great communicator of what I'm studying, which I think is really, really important moving forward. But that brings me to, I don't know if you talked in your book about it, but what was the book with the DDT when DDT, was it Spring Hill?
No, Silent Spring.
Silent Spring.
Yeah.
Silent Spring.
But it's interesting. She was trained as a biologist. I mean, she also wrote a book called The Sea Around Us that was, not as well known as by far as Silent Spring. But anyway, she had a master's degree in biology. Fascinating story there. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. Tell us a little bit about that story. I don't know too much about it.
I was just thinking about some of her work. Again, she was trained as a marine biologist, and as I mentioned, did some of these other books about the ocean. And she was writing for the New Yorker, and these series of articles about the problems caused by DDT, and it resulted in Silent Spring. Really, as you may guess, heavily criticized by the chemical industry because I think the main problem was she was a woman, and she didn't have the status of someone who is working in the field. And probably was the birth of environmentalism, and certainly in this country back in the early 60s.
It led to some big things from my understanding. Like I was doing some research recently because we're in Greenwich, right? We're here for 6 weeks. And I mean, I think I did some research. There's like 20 billionaires within like 15 miles of where I'm at. Yeah. I mean, like Ray Dalio is, his office is 13 minutes away from where we're at. But one of the other guys, I can't remember his name. He's like, worth like 78 billion. But him and his wife were two of the biggest proponents of the Environmental Defense Fund, I believe.
Yeah.
And that seemed to have originated at the time of Silent Spring. Yeah. And the reason that I kind of brought this up is because that was a very visible thing, right? Where all these falcons and birds were just dropping dead out of nowhere. And that's something I feel like you can kind of rally people to more, right? Of like, hey, have you seen that? Have you seen a bird just dead in the street all of a sudden, or there's lots of them dying? And it seems like you can gather momentum politically much faster. Did that lead to, so the environmental defense, fund, but what happened after that? How did DDT gets banned after that?
Yeah, it was soon after that, but it must have been at least 10 years. I don't know the history well enough to say how long it took for it to be banned. So that's a good question, how long after that. But it certainly was the start of it, or at least an important component of it.
Right. And it seems like now we're dealing with challenges that are more invisible, they're more micro, as well as industries are also even more powerful than they were in the 70s.
That's right. That's right.
Even
you pointed out BP with the carbon footprint. I had heard that same story about, on one hand, we are all responsible. We're putting gas into our gas guzzling SUVs and so on. But on the other hand, it takes away the responsibility that those industries have in polluting.
Right. And it's the majority of there. But I don't know. It's fascinating because it seems like we're wanting to just do band-aid solutions and everything is in order to protect, the free market, essentially. The free market
it's not really free. But the other argument is that, well, people need their jobs. We need to be able to have a good life. And it's often argued as being or put against having less CO2 in the atmosphere. It says an environment or free jobs or good jobs. And I think that's a false dichotomy there. It's not really the case. I think you can have a better life by appreciating the environment than what we're doing now.
Yeah. And it's tricky. I've as someone who also lived, I lived in China for 2 years, and there it's a really fascinating phenomenon that's happening there. There was a whole movement this last year, and it happened from one guy who wrote this blog that went viral on I think Weibo or Baidu, which is the social media or the Google kind of China. And it's essentially, it was a manifesto, and it's called the Lying Flat Manifesto, which is just this call to action to young people and saying, look, we should not keep up this lifestyle of this nonstop working and just this madness of fast-paced culture that we're living. And it's fascinating because that's only been happening for them for really the past max 30 to 40 years, really only the past 20 years in China, especially for the younger generation, for the millennial generation and the Gen Xers. It's really only 20 years. But the United States has been going through it for a much longer time, with industrialization happening earlier. But it's fascinating because it seems like this could be one of the few indicators of a way to reach this idea of living a slower life. Not, we don't have to be constantly innovating to this no end where, we were supposed to have less work with computers. Right. That didn't happen.
That didn't happen, right?
They followed us home, and then we were told to answer emails at all times of the day based on culture. Not even, I don't know many bosses who would say, hey, you should answer an email, but I know lots of bosses who would give a promotion to the person who does answer their email, at 10 o'clock at night, versus the person who says, hey, when I'm home, I'm with my family and my friends and I do my life. Those people don't tend to get promoted in the culture we have. And it seems like we're reaching a pinnacle of, okay, wait a second. It's not only about technological innovation of green industries, but it's also about slowing down and consuming less and doing less of some things, right? For all of time, one of the main things that we would do is cook food.
Search for it and cook it.
Search for it and cook it was one of the main activities. And we probably enjoyed ourselves quite a bit, actually, during that time. Whereas now it's like, is there a prepped meal plan that I can get? Because eating is, if you can give it to me in a pill, I'll take it in a pill. You know what I mean? There's no joy. There's no joy of it. And I've been one of those people. When I was an entrepreneur working 7 days a week, it's protein bars, protein shakes, all these things that are not real food.
Right.
And we do that. But I'm really hoping that we come into a place where we can slow down. And I think nature teaches us that part of, hey, actually taking a walk in the forest is actually way more enjoyable than watching a movie.
Yeah. I think one of the, if there's a good thing about the pandemic, I mean, of course, it's been horrible for many people, is that it has forced folks to kind of reassess their relationship to work. This whole idea about commuting, for example, that you can do this at your home, and people can work at home and don't have to get into a gas guzzling car and drive 2 hours to their job. That alone, I think, may have many positive impacts on our society.
Right. And I was reading though the other day that that there really though wasn't that much reduction in CO2 emissions during that time.
No.
Which was one of the disheartening.
Yeah, it was
things.
just I've seen the same studies and data that doesn't. But in other aspects of our life, I hope it has some positive impact.
Definitely, I agree. The did you do a lot of writing during the pandemic, or what did you do?
Yeah, I retired basically as the pandemic was developing, and so in some ways it could have been it was bad timing because I had all these plans of trying to start another phase of my career that has been put on hold. Plus side is, I mean, I was doing a lot of we have to, because we're a split campus, I was doing a lot of remote teaching. We always were doing that. We had students in front of us and students at the other end. So we had to do this type of technology to reach those other students at the other end. So I wasn't totally unaware of that technology and how to do that. But to totally go that way and do it totally by Zoom, say, would have been a lot of work. So I'm glad I missed that.
Yeah.
So yeah, because of the pandemic, I've been able to concentrate more on the writing.
Wow. And you said that you wanted to, you're planning on having kind of a second career after this. What do you want to do?
I wanted to, I'd like to do some more volunteer work with some environmental groups around in this area, more low, smaller scale. And then I'd like to continue on to do, I'm working on another book now about climate change and microbes, and the role of microbes in climate change. So
wow,
between those two, I'll keep you busy.
What's a little bit of a teaser on that? What is kind of one of the main components of that?
Well, basically, microbes are everywhere, and certainly in the ocean, they're the reason why the oceans are a big reason why the oceans take up a lot of CO2. So to back up, roughly a third. Was a quarter of the CO2 that we are emitting now goes into the ocean. Another quarter or so goes into soils, and then only half of what we emit stays in the atmosphere. So it could be even worse if we did not have these ocean and terrestrial sinks. So microbes are very much involved in why the oceans and land are taking up so much CO2. So
right.
That's the main thing. But they're also involved in other gases, methane. So really, only microbes consume methane and naturally produce methane. So they're very much involved in methane, another important greenhouse gas.
I was researching recently with all the carbon credit stuff. So the mangrove forests actually are the largest carbon sink, and they're called blue credits, and people believe that those will have a premium in the market because they have, the amount of carbon they sequester is like 10x what a regular forest would do, something like that.
Yeah. So what's your thoughts about the carbon tax? Have you looked into that much? You thought much?
Carbon tax, I haven't looked into too much, but I would say from what I can see, it looks like that's really what needs to happen.
Yeah.
It seems like the market is not going to be able to solve this on its own. So there needs to be, there has to be a more governmental approach into it. I liken it to, one of the other industry that I liken it to that I have experience in would be the California almond industry, which is, notorious for, pumping, using a lot of water. But it's actually interesting. And I just filmed a podcast episode with the vice president of one of the largest companies. But he's also one of the most liberal guys in the entire industry. And we talked about all these things. But what's interesting is that almonds are actually have the lowest carbon footprint of all foods. Yeah. A tree like that.
Right.
And my argument would be is that they have the potential to become one of the best crops if we start to farm them in a better way. If every almond farm had a 25 species cover crop on it instead of bare ground. And we started rebuilding the soil because most of that soil has been degraded and it's all just dirt.
Yeah.
There's no water infiltration. So when you do get rain, you're not infiltrating it, which the rebuilding all of the biology and the soil structure would lead to more water infiltration. But this would not have happened without, or the big thing that's coming into that industry is that you have what's called SGMA, which is the legislation that Governor Jerry Brown put into play in the drought about maybe 5 or 10 years ago, essentially, maybe 10 years ago. I'm not sure, but that is now where they're starting. You have to have a plan for your basin of the water basin that you're in. There has to be a plan for how is this basin going to be better managed and how are we going to make this basin sustainable with water. And that's going to mean, reductions in pumping limitations for farmers as well as industrial uses and all these things. And the reality is that the market would have just never come to that. The market before that is if I'm a farmer and this is my property and I'm going to stick my straw into the earth and I'm going to suck as hard and as fast as I can. And that's where we really get into this. Well, is this a commons resource, right? Is this a commons resource or is this a private property? And then we can get into a whole host of issues of what the problems are with, the idea even of private property, which the native peoples, I'm sure, could tell us all about. But, it seems like a carbon tax is necessary. But I'm really interested in what I call like the duct tape solutions that I see. So like one of them is for like the cattle industry is that, hey, well, if we feed them seaweed, they will belch 30% less.
Yeah, less methane. Yeah, I saw that too. That's
incredible. Right, yeah. Which is incredible.
Even more than that. I think they will. Even more than that.
I think it is. I think I'm short selling it, which is the preferred method on the podcast.
No problem.
Yeah. But another thing that's happening, there's a company in Texas, a bio company that's trying to create different microorganisms to populate the gut of the cow that would reduce it even more than that. These to me are actually most probably bad ideas. These are not good ideas because these are those classic ideas where we think it's going to be driven by some really great science, but the second order effects are going to be way worse. And to me, that says is, okay, wait a second. I'm already seeing in the health and nutrition space a rapid increase in demand for seaweed products, right? I mean, Costco now sells organic seaweed snacks.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's completely new in the past couple of years that they would carry a product like that. And then all of a sudden, if we have the cattle industry wanting all of this seaweed from the ocean as well, and that leads to, okay, well, now there's going to be this new seaweed industry, but we still haven't perfected growing things in the oceans and bays and things without doing damage. So I'm worried about creating a tremendous amount of demand for some idea to then mitigate this other thing that maybe that's not really the source problem. The source problem is that we probably all need to eat less meat.
I was going to say it's a easy technological fix for a problem that the fix probably is not very good at all. I mean, the number I saw is 90%, which is probably way too high, but it's probably not even 30% in reality. And it kind of takes us off the hook, most people off the hook of just eating less red meat.
Right. And again, and I eat red meat today. I'm not pure vegetarian, and I'm through the, going through the process of, all right, how do we, what is it that we need? Because there are things like iron and things that you don't get in the same way in a plant. I mean, you would have to eat,
or at least it'd be harder. You'd have to work at it more.
You have to work. I mean, you have to be, essentially you become like the bodybuilder type who's, spooning as much kale as you can every several hours to get the iron and stuff like that. But it's not impossible. But I mean, think about the ramifications of putting in a bunch of microbes that have been created in a lab into this animal now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's too far for me. You know what I mean? I'm from the perspective of, actually, let's go back to the farthest we can go back in the cow genetics of natural as possible, where it's been less and less hybridized, and let's just graze that as properly as we can, if even that's a good idea.
Right.
You know, instead of okay, hang on, how do we manipulate this cow using all of our techniques in order to do this?
Right.
You know, so it's the carbon component is very new for me in terms of my research. And it's fascinating. One thing I'm thinking of creating is a different model in a website, because going back to the California almonds, the California almond takes it's 460 something gallons to make 4 ounces of almonds. But, and this is a huge but, I ask people all the time, when's the last time you threw away some lettuce? When's the last time you threw away a tomato? When's the last time you threw away an avocado? When's the last time you threw away any kind of citrus fruit or other vegetable that went bad? I don't know anyone who can't say, I threw away something in the last week. Now, let's assume that lettuce took only 40 gallons of water, or the orange took 50 gallons of water compared to that 460 that the almond took. Yeah. But guess what? When's the last time you threw almonds away?
Right. Yeah,
you probably haven't, because they have roughly a 2-year shelf life.
Yeah, right.
So on a net basis, tremendous amounts more of water are being wasted with other crops that go bad in our refrigerators than almonds at the end of the day.
Right.
And this part's fascinating to me, because it doesn't negate the water issues in California. It doesn't negate the need for better practices, but it does bring light to a nuanced scenario and question,
right,
which is what we're dealing with here. And it blows my mind when I think about that. You know, I don't think I've ever thrown almonds away, you know, and almonds are actually even better than, a walnut will go rancid much faster than an almond.
A walnut. Walnuts in the refrigerator because of that.
Exactly.
Almonds are room temperature, yeah.
Room temperature, and if you kept them in a freezer, it'd probably even longer than 2 years, right? You could go for a very long time.
Yeah.
But that's interesting to me in that way. But then you have the issue of, okay, well, from the last thing that I read, that, you know, almonds use more glyphosate is applied to almonds than any other crop. That's a problem.
Yeah.
You know, that's a problem. So how can we work on that? How can we bring that pesticide use down in that way? But these are all just fascinating. This is part of the reason of having this podcast, is because, you know, I've seen the almond industry literally from the bare ground in California all the way to the end consumer in India and in China. And I used to sit in the markets, in these crazy Asian markets where people walk through with the market in Delhi in India is called Karibali, and they literally $1 billion in cash walks through that place every day.
Wow.
It's the largest commodities market in Asia. And I used to go sit there with the almond buyers in these little tiny, a quarter of the room that I'm in right now, these little tiny squares in like this like underground dungeon thing. And people are walking by with spices on their head and huge sacks. And you walk by different areas, and over here's the dry fruits and nuts, and over here's all the different spices and all these different commodities. And it was just fascinating to see the entire supply chain all the way through. And I would go and visit the factories of our buyers from the California side. And then eventually I ended up building a factory there with my business partner. Cool. And so I've seen this industry, and I've seen some other agricultural industries in this light. And that's very unique. Most people will never get that opportunity to see something like that. What it did was it exposed me to both the good, the bad, and the myths, right? I'm interested in the myths of the industry of, okay, we have to feed the world. Where did that come from?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's an interesting idea. Do we really is the average farmer's intention really to feed the world, or is it to get the best price for their product?
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of questions like that. But the idea with the website that I'm thinking about, long story long, is there's nowhere you can go and see, okay, hang on, here's the carbon footprint of this product. Here's the water footprint of this product. Here's the, maybe we create a fertilizer footprint of this product. And here's a social political footprint of this product, right? Because I have a book that's called How Bad is a Banana? And this guy, essentially, he does a carbon footprint for roughly 500 different products. And he claims the banana is actually a great product because of the nutrients that it has for such a low carbon footprint that it has. Because interestingly, most transportation doesn't factor into a large carbon footprint unless it gets onto, like, a ship versus a truck is very different.
Yeah.
But the first woman that I interviewed for the podcast also wrote a book on just bananas culturally and all the things that have happened there, right? Where there's lots of colonial things and lots of exploitation, the Banana Republic and all those ideas. Yeah. So it's never that simple.
Right.
As one metric.
Right. Yeah, I think that's getting back to the almond. I think that's one place where science comes in, is you look at not just the one figure that you cited, how much water it uses, but when's the last time you threw out a water? I threw out an almond.
Right.
I was thinking back to the biofuel example. On one hand, I see, wow, what a great idea to replace a fossil fuel with a renewable energy source, but they have to realize the cost of making that fossil fuel. So I think that's where a bit more information would help people understand, even if they don't do anything different, at least they would be more knowledgeable about a particular topic.
Yeah. But it's difficult. I think that we're also approaching this time where for the average person, it's kind of maddening. It's a lot of work to try and understand. And then we're told, and everyone's so criticizing now. And it's like, I eat bananas. Then someone goes, you're a fool for eating bananas. You know what I mean? And then you're like, well, okay, I eat almonds. You're like, you shouldn't eat almonds either. And, okay, who can I,
what can you eat?
What can you eat? And what do you do? And just all these different questions. And that's also a part of the goal is to just bring some easier ways to listen to someone like you to explain, your work and the importance of it, and to be able to understand that, okay, wait a second, what is my role on this? What can I do? So let's kind of start to close with that. Is what do you think is something that the average person can do to help this particular situation of dead zones?
Well, we've kind of touched on some of the things already. Food waste is one right there. A tremendous amount of food is wasted. We talked already about how much food we throw away after it gets to our house, but even before it gets to our house, a lot of it's thrown away. If we could somehow reduce that waste, that would be great. And if you think about it, when we go to a grocery store, we're picking out the best looking fruit, vegetables, and so on, and all the ugly ones are probably going to be tossed. If we had a bit more liberal attitude about those not so good looking pieces of fruit, that would help with the waste problem. The other one is so the general message here is food production. If we somehow would reduce that, for most Americans don't face a problem of food insecurity. It is a problem for some Americans, but not for most. Most Americans have the opposite problem. They eat too much, right? Obesity is a big problem in this country. So if they could reduce their food intake, that would help. You mean less corn that is grown and less fertilizer that's applied. And if I would talk about one food that people should eat less of, is red meat. Red meat is really harmful to the environment for many reasons. And before we get to the environment, of course, red meat eating too much of it is bad for our health. I still eat red meat. I'm still a carnivore. I don't eat a lot of red meat. That's more because of the taste more than anything. So I don't think it means going to a totally vegetarian diet, but certainly too many people eat too much red meat. And red meat just basically, you have to feed those cattle so much more corn, antibiotics. I've talked about that already. They are fed a lot of antibiotics, and they emit a lot of other greenhouse gases, not just CO2, but we talked already about methane. They're a big emitter of methane. Overall, agriculture is roughly about a third of the greenhouse gas emissions are somehow connected with agriculture. So I would think just thinking a bit more about the food that you eat would go a long way to solving the problem.
Right. And what do you think that the even having a lawn and fertilizing that lawn and stuff like that is something that they could look into?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I've never understood the big lawn and spending hours and hours on a CO2 belching lawnmower. The fertilizer that they're adding to the lawn is probably not the huge problem. It certainly doesn't help. Some of that fertilizer is going to end up in a nearby stream. But grass is fairly good. At least the studies that have been done on golf courses show that golf courses are really a lot of fertilizer applied to golf courses. And a lot of that just stays right there, fortunately. So that's not probably the thing I would harp on the most. I look more what's happening inside the house or at the barbecue.
Yeah, I would say from a little bit that I've seen, though, that there are lots of golf courses that are in very particular areas that are critical areas. And there's some, in San Francisco, that'll be close to the estuaries and things where we wouldn't want to necessarily be doing that. But yeah, the lawn idea is funny, right? Because it's really where we should be growing a little bit of our own food, not all of it. We don't have to grow all of our own food. I'm not a proponent of that, but if you could grow 20% of your own food, if you have a lawn and exactly what you put into it, you also develop your relationship with nature at a deeper level. It's one of the healthiest things we can do on a lot of different, on a lot of different fronts, not only from what we intake on a nutrient basis. It seems like that to me is, I'm always curious and looking for what is something that I, as an average person, really have some control over, It's tough.
Getting back to what we eat, we have lots of control over that, although advertisers certainly sway that quite a bit.
Right.
Even if you don't grow your own food, if there's something else you do with your lawns, you're not spending all your time on a riding lawnmower every day or every weekend. So those type of things, I think, have, as you kind of alluded to, so many other benefits. That's what I kind of look for too. Also, is you do something that has just not, reducing nutrients, but it helps with greenhouse gases and it helps with your own health. It has these, multiple benefits to you and those around you.
Definitely. Yeah. Looking for the co-benefits is a really big thing. And I think I also just for one, final closing point is I just want to bring up the topic of just moving away from the anthropocentric view of the world. We have this just chronic view that we are the center of the universe and that it's all about the human species. And that's what's leading us to not be able to empathize and have a relationship with all of the other organisms that are actually supporting us and all of this life. And until we start to be more inclusive with all beings, human and non-human, I feel like we're going to continue to have a lot of these challenges.
Yeah, I think, it's not just the well-being of these other organisms, it's our own well-being. Now that, going back to a human-centric view, that's one argument to put forward, is that our own well-being depends on these other organisms and life around us. Certainly the quality of our life depends on them.
Right. The quality. It's very much it's the quality as well as what seems to be coming as the possibility of our life.
Yeah. I'm not an extremist that way. I think people are amazingly resilient, and we would probably survive anything. If the worst comes to pass with climate change, but who wants to live in that world?
Yeah, I don't think we do, and I think we do want to live in a world where we are enjoying ourselves more with that connection to nature, with the connection to our food and all these different things. And so, right. Well, David, thank you very much for your time. This was fantastic. I have to say, I was a little bit more worried about this podcast because there's a lot of science there, but you did a fantastic job of guiding me through it, and I really appreciate your time. And we wish you the best of luck on your upcoming book. And hopefully we'll have you back on after that comes out.
I love that. This has been really rewarding, enjoyable. Thanks a lot, Justin.
Awesome. Well, take care. I'll send you an email on some natural farming stuff for your wife.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it.
All right. Take care.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.